Hey there, everyone. Welcome back. And if you're new here, you're in for a treat or maybe a chill down your spine. Now, I know a lot of you like to relax or even drift off to sleep while listening to these stories. Don't worry, I totally get it. But before you get too comfy, take a second to drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. It's always cool to see where our spooky little community is from. And hey, if you're enjoying these eerie tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future chills and thrills. Trust me, the best is yet to come. Alright, grab your blanket, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's story. Something that just might keep you up a little longer than you planned. Ready? Let's begin. It was a rainy night, the kind of rain that blurs the world into a single watery mass. The windshield wipers worked overtime, struggling to keep up with the downpour that hammered against the glass. My headlights barely cut through the sheets of rain, illuminating only a few feet ahead before the light was swallowed by the darkness. I was tired, my eyes burning from hours of driving, but there was one more ride left to go. I glanced at my phone, which lit up with a new ride request. I was about to decline, thinking it was time to head home, but something made me pause. The request came from a neighborhood not far from where I was. I sighed, knowing I could use the extra money. With a tired nod to myself, I accepted the ride and made a U-turn, heading toward the pickup point. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car that zoomed past, its headlights momentarily piercing through the storm. The rain pounded relentlessly on the roof of my car, the sound loud and unyielding. Streetlights flickered as I passed them, their glow barely visible through the rain-soaked windows. I pulled up to the curb, the GPS indicating that I had arrived at the requested location. It was a dark, deserted street corner, not the kind of place you'd want to linger at, especially not on a night like this. I glanced around, expecting to see my passenger, but the street was empty. I checked the app again, no cancellation. Sighing, I waited, my eyes scanning the rain-soaked surroundings. After a few moments, I saw him. He appeared out of the shadows, a tall figure draped in a dark, waterlogged hoodie. His hood was pulled low over his face, and his movements were deliberate, almost too calm for someone braving such a storm. He moved toward the car with purpose, opened the back door without a word, and slid into the seat behind me. His movements were smooth, practiced. "Hey there, how's it going?" I greeted, trying to sound casual despite the unease creeping up my spine. No response. His gaze was fixed on the window, watching the rain as it ran in rivulets down the glass. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, and I couldn't make out his expression. I shrugged off the discomfort. Some people just didn't like small talk, I reasoned. Still, something about his silence, his stillness, felt off. I pulled away from the curb, the tires splashing through puddles as we drove into the night. The only sound was the relentless beat of the rain and the hum of the engine. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but he didn't move. His hands were clenched in his lap, fingers tightly wound together. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity. The rain was unrelenting, hammering against the roof like an endless barrage of bullets. Every now and then, I'd steal a glance at him in the mirror. He hadn't shifted an inch. His hands, still tightly clasped in his lap, seemed to tense with each passing mile. The GPS indicated that we were nearing his destination. I was more than ready for this ride to be over. There was something unsettling about this man. The air in the car felt thick with tension, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from him as soon as possible. As we approached the drop-off point, I began to slow down. That's when he spoke for the first time. "Keep driving," he said, his voice low and rough, barely audible over the sound of the rain. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake. "What?" "Keep driving," he repeated, more firmly this time. There was something in his tone that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a request, it was a command. My hand tightened on the steering wheel, and I felt my pulse quicken. Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer immediately. I glanced at him in the mirror again, but his face was still obscured, his eyes fixed on something beyond the window. "Just drive," he said after a long pause. "I'll tell you when to stop." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. There was a knot of fear tightening in my stomach, but I couldn't bring myself to refuse him. Something about the way he spoke made it clear that stopping wasn't an option. With a shaky nod, I pressed down on the gas and continued driving, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who was this guy? What did he want? Why was he telling me to keep driving? Minutes passed in tense silence. The rain grew heavier, turning the world outside into a blurry mess of shadows and light. I didn't dare ask him again where we were going. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. "Turn left here," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the oppressive quiet. I looked at the road ahead. There was no street sign, just a narrow, muddy path leading off into the trees. My stomach churned with unease, but I did as he said. The car bounced as we left the paved road, the tires slipping in the mud. The headlights illuminated the thick trunks of trees looming on either side of us, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. The road, if you could call it that, was narrow and winding, and the rain made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every bump, every twist in the path sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I had no idea where we were going, and the further we drove, the more isolated I felt. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "Stop here." I brought the car to a halt, my heart pounding in my chest. We were in the middle of nowhere. There were no houses, no lights, just the thick, impenetrable darkness of the forest. "What now?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. He didn't answer right away. I heard the sound of the door creaking open, and I glanced back in the mirror to see him stepping out into the rain. He stood there for a moment, unmoving, as the rain poured down around him, soaking through his already drenched hoodie. Then, without warning, he slammed the door shut and disappeared into the trees. I sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind raced. Should I drive away? Should I wait for him to come back? What if he didn't come back? The minutes ticked by, and the rain continued to pound against the roof. My hands were still gripping the wheel, my knuckles aching from the tension. The forest around me was eerily silent, save for the sound of the rain and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, very wrong. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It had been nearly 10 minutes since he left. 10 minutes of sitting in this car, alone, in the middle of the woods, with no idea where I was or why I was even here. I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to get out of here. Just as I reached for the gear shift, I heard something. A noise, faint, barely audible over the sound of the rain, but distinct enough to send a chill down my spine. It was coming from the trees. I strained my ears, trying to make out what it was. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the underbrush, getting closer and closer. My heart raced. Was it him? Was he coming back? But something felt off. The footsteps weren't coming from the direction he had gone. They were coming from the other side of the car, from the darkness beyond the reach of the headlights. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the car and get the hell out of there. But before I could turn the key, the passenger door flew open. A hand reached in, grabbing me by the collar and yanking me out of the driver's seat. I barely had time to react before I was thrown onto the muddy ground, my head spinning from the impact. I looked up, dazed and terrified, to see the hooded man standing over me. His face was still hidden in the shadows of his hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unforgiving. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, his voice low and menacing. Before I could say anything, before I could even process what was happening, he raised something in his hand, something sharp, glinting in the faint light of the car's headlights. I scrambled backward, my heart racing, but he was too fast. The blade came down, slicing through the air with terrifying precision. I screamed, rolling to the side just in time to avoid the blow. My hands dug into the wet earth as I pushed myself to my feet, my body shaking with fear and adrenaline. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. I ran into the forest, my feet slipping on the muddy ground, branches whipping against my face as I tore through the trees. The rain was blinding, the wind howling in my ears, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. All that mattered was getting away. Behind me, I could hear him, his footsteps pounding against the ground as he chased after me. His breath was heavy, labored, but he was fast, too fast. I stumbled, my ankle twisting painfully as I lost my footing on a slick patch of mud. I cried out, but forced myself to keep going, my heart thundering in my chest. The trees were closing in around me, their branches clawing at my clothes, my skin. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to keep running, keep moving, or I was going to die. Suddenly, I burst through the trees and into a small clearing. My eyes widened in shock as I saw the faint glow of a building in the distance, a cabin, its windows glowing with the warm light of a fire. Hope surged through me, and I sprinted toward the cabin, my legs burning with the effort. I could hear him behind me, closer now, his breath rasping in the darkness. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. With one final burst of energy, I reached the door of the cabin and threw it open, collapsing inside just as the hooded man reached the clearing. The door slammed shut behind me, and I lay there on the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I had made it. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. Yet. It was an ordinary evening. I was in my apartment, alone, cooking dinner after a long day at work. The sizzle of the pan, the warm aroma of spices filling the air, it was comforting, familiar. I had been in this routine for months, living alone and getting used to the quiet solitude. In a way, I enjoyed the peace. It gave me time to unwind, to decompress. The sound of the rain outside only added to the cozy atmosphere. It was one of those steady, gentle rains, not too heavy, just enough to make the world outside feel distant and quiet. I had the TV on in the background, playing some random show I wasn't really paying attention to. I was lost in my thoughts, the sound of my spatula scraping against the pan as I stirred the vegetables. That's when I heard it. A knock at the door. A knock at the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just a soft, almost hesitant knock, but it was enough to jar me out of my relaxed state. I paused, listening. Who could be knocking at this hour? I wasn't expecting anyone, and I rarely had visitors. The building I lived in was small, with only a few tenants, and most of them kept to themselves. It was late enough that a knock at the door felt strange. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it. Maybe it was a neighbor who knocked on the wrong door, or someone trying to sell something. But curiosity got the better of me, and I turned off the stove, wiped my hands on a towel, and walked toward the door. I hesitated for a moment before peering through the peephole. The hallway outside was dimly lit, as usual, but there was no one there. I blinked, confused. Had I imagined it? I pressed my ear against the door, listening, but there was only silence. The quiet hum of the hallway lights and the faint sound of rain against the windows. No footsteps, no voices. I frowned, my hand resting on the doorknob. Maybe it was just a prank, some kids messing around in the building. But before I could turn away, I noticed something small sitting on the welcome mat outside my door. A package. I opened the door slowly, just wide enough to get a better look. There, sitting innocently on the mat, was a small, nondescript box. It was wrapped in brown paper, the edges neatly folded, and my name was scrawled across the front in neat handwriting. But there was no return address, no indication of who had left it. My heart skipped a beat. Who had left this, and why? I glanced up and down the hallway, but it was still empty, no sign of anyone. The building was quiet, almost eerily so. I picked up the package, feeling its weight in my hands. It wasn't particularly heavy, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I closed the door behind me and locked it, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone in the building dropped it off? Maybe it was a mistake, meant for someone else. But then why was my name on it? And why now, in the middle of the night? I set the package down on the kitchen counter, staring at it. Part of me wanted to just throw it away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut the tape sealing the box. As I peeled back the brown paper, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside was a smaller box, wrapped in black velvet. My heart was pounding in my chest now, each beat louder than the last. I reached for the velvet covering, hesitating for just a second before pulling it away. And that's when I saw it. A hand. A severed, pale, lifeless hand lying motionless at the bottom of the box. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I dropped the package, the box falling to the floor with a dull thud. The hand lay there, fingers curled slightly, as if frozen in some last, desperate grasp. My mind raced. What the hell was this? Was it a prank? Some kind of sick joke? But as I looked closer, I realized the hand was too real, too detailed. The skin was pale, almost gray, and there was a faint trace of dried blood around the severed wrist. It looked fresh. My stomach churned and I stumbled back, knocking into the kitchen counter. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I wanted to believe it was fake, some kind of elaborate prop, but deep down I knew the truth. This was real. I had to get out of there. I had to call someone, the police, anyone. But as I turned to grab my phone, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible thud. It came from behind me, near the box. My blood ran cold. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I turned around, my eyes fixed on the box still lying on the floor. The hand had moved. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. The fingers, which had been curled inward, were now stretched out slightly, as if reaching for something. My breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. But as I stood there, paralyzed by fear, the hand twitched again. This time, the movement was more pronounced. The fingers flexed, the knuckles cracking faintly in the silence of the room. I backed away, my legs shaking beneath me. I had to get out of here. I had to. The hand shot up from the box, landing with a soft thud on the kitchen counter. It moved with unnatural speed, its fingers skittering across the surface like a spider's legs. My stomach churned with terror as I watched it move, inching closer to the edge of the counter, closer to me. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as I scrambled to put distance between myself and the grotesque, animated hand. My back hit the wall, and I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. But before I could press call, the hand launched itself off the counter. It flew through the air, its fingers outstretched like claws, and landed on my chest with a sickening thud. I screamed, stumbling backward as I tried to tear it off me. But it was stronger than it should have been. Its fingers dug into my shirt, clawing at my skin. I stumbled into the living room, thrashing wildly as I tried to pry the hand off me. My vision blurred with panic as I struggled against its grip, my heart hammering in my chest. Finally, with a desperate scream, I managed to rip it off and fling it across the room. The hand hit the wall with a wet smack and fell to the floor, twitching. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted for the door, yanking it open with shaking hands. I flew down the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the cold tile as I raced for the exit. The rain was still coming down hard when I burst out of the building and into the street. The cold wind hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I just kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind spinning with fear and disbelief. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, drenched from the rain and gasping for air. I collapsed onto a bench, my hands trembling as I clutched my phone to my chest. I had to call the police. I had to report what had happened. But as I sat there, my mind racing, I realized something. The box. It had my name on it. Whoever had left that package at my door knew who I was. They knew where I lived. And they had sent me that. I shivered, my body trembling with fear and cold. I didn't want to think about what that meant. I didn't want to think about who might have been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver their gruesome gift. I fumbled with my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. The operator picked up almost immediately, her voice calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, my mind still reeling from what I had just experienced. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. There's a hand, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. Someone left a severed hand at my door. It moved. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. A hand, sir. You said it moved. Yes, I practically shouted, my voice rising with panic. It's real. It was in a package. And it. Another sound from behind me, a soft scraping, like nails against wood. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I turned to look over my shoulder. There, standing in the rain, just a few feet away from the bench, was the hand. It stood upright, balanced on its fingertips, its pale skin gleaming wetly in the dim streetlight, and it was moving toward me. Sir? Sir? Are you still there? The operator's voice crackled through the phone. But I couldn't respond. My throat was tight with fear, my body frozen in place as I watched the hand creep closer, its fingers clawing at the ground with each step. I dropped the phone and ran. I had been driving for hours. The open road stretched ahead of me, an endless ribbon of asphalt winding through the barren desert landscape. There was nothing on either side of the highway but sand and scrub brush, the occasional cactus breaking up the monotony. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving only the faint glow of twilight to light the way. The air outside was hot and dry, even this late at night, and my car's air conditioning was on full blast to keep the stifling desert heat at bay. I was driving back from a work trip, miles from the nearest town. My only company was the faint hum of the car's engine and the crackle of the radio as it tried, unsuccessfully, to pick up a station in this desolate stretch of highway. I should have been exhausted, but the adrenaline kept me awake. My car had been acting up for the past few miles, sputtering and jerking occasionally as if it was struggling to stay alive. The gas gauge still showed half a tank, but something about the engine didn't feel right. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white as I watched the dark road ahead. The headlights illuminated the cracked pavement, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Every so often, a tumbleweed would blow across the highway, its dry branches rustling in the night breeze. But other than that, I was completely alone. Until I wasn't. It started with a low rumble in the distance, barely audible over the sound of my car's engine. I squinted into the rearview mirror, expecting to see the lights of an oncoming vehicle, but the desert behind me was just as dark and empty as the road ahead. I glanced at the dashboard, nervously checking the temperature gauge. The needle had been climbing steadily for the past few minutes, edging dangerously close to the red zone. The engine sputtered again, more violently this time, and I felt a jolt as the car lurched forward, the steering wheel vibrating in my hands. "Come on," I muttered, urging the car to keep going, just a few more miles. But the car didn't listen. With a final, shuddering groan, the engine gave out, and the car coasted to a stop on the side of the road. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard in disbelief. The engine light blinked on, taunting me with its glowing orange hue. I sighed, slamming my hands against the steering wheel in frustration. This was the last thing I needed. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest gas station or town, with no cell service to call for help. The desert stretched out around me, silent and still, like some vast, empty void. I glanced at my phone, hoping for a miracle, but the screen showed the same thing it had been showing for the past hour: no signal. Great, just great. I stepped out of the car, the hot desert air hitting me like a wall. The heat had lingered long after the sun had gone down, and the ground beneath my feet still radiated warmth. I popped the hood and peered inside, not really expecting to find anything. I wasn't exactly a mechanic, and even if I were, there wasn't much I could do in the middle of the desert with no tools and no idea what was wrong. The engine hissed softly, the smell of overheated metal filling the air. I poked around for a few minutes, but it was clear that I wasn't going to be able to fix this on my own. I slammed the hood shut and leaned against the side of the car, wiping the sweat from my brow. The desert was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every little sound. The only noise was the faint rustle of the wind, whispering through the dry scrub brush. I looked up and down the highway, hoping to see the distant glow of headlights, but the road was empty. Just me, the desert, and the oppressive silence. For a moment, I considered waiting it out, hoping that another car would come by eventually. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized how unlikely that was. This stretch of highway wasn't exactly well-traveled, especially not at this hour. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly midnight. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. I was completely alone. I tried to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that had been building in the pit of my stomach since the car broke down. I told myself I could handle this. I'd been in worse situations before, right? All I needed to do was stay calm, figure out my next move. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling sound in the distance, like the growl of an engine. I straightened up, my heart leaping with hope. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. I turned, scanning the horizon for the source of the noise, and then, in the distance, I saw it. A pair of headlights growing steadily brighter as they approached. Relief flooded through me. I waved my arms, signaling for the driver to stop. As the vehicle drew closer, I could make out the shape of a large truck, its hulking frame silhouetted against the dark desert landscape. The truck slowed as it neared, pulling over to the side of the road. The engine rumbled loudly as the driver rolled down his window. Beneath a hand, a gruff voice called out from the cab. I stepped closer, squinting against the glare of the headlights. The driver was an older man with a grizzled face and a thick beard. He wore a worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and his hands rested casually on the steering wheel. "Yeah, my car broke down," I said, my voice shaky with relief. "I've been out here for a while. No signal. I could really use a lift to the nearest town." The man nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Hop in? I'll take you as far as I can." I hesitated for a split second, a flicker of unease crossing my mind. There was something about the way he looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to glint in the darkness. But I pushed the thought aside. I didn't have many options, and the idea of spending the night stranded in the desert was far worse than getting into a truck with a stranger. I climbed into the passenger seat, closing the door behind me. The inside of the cab was dimly lit, the dashboard casting a faint orange glow. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and old leather. The man shifted the truck into gear, and we started down the highway again, the rumble of the engine filling the silence. For the first few miles, neither of us said anything. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional creak of the truck's suspension as we hit a bump in the road. I glanced at the driver out of the corner of my eye. He stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his jaw set in a firm line. "So, you're heading to the nearest town?" I asked, trying to break the silence. The man nodded, but didn't look at me. "Yeah, I'll get you there." There was something off about his tone, something too flat, too emotionless. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than met the eye. We drove for a few more minutes in silence before he spoke again. "You live alone?" The question caught me off guard. I turned to him, frowning. "What?" "You live alone," he repeated, his voice low, almost a growl. "Anyone know you're out here?" My stomach twisted with unease. Why would he ask me that? It was such an odd question, especially given the circumstances. Yeah, I live alone," I said hesitantly. "Why?" The man didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road, but I could feel him watching me, studying me, like he was sizing me up for something. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was very wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a growing sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I glanced at the dashboard, looking for some sign that we were getting closer to civilization, but the highway stretched on endlessly into the night. No streetlights, no buildings, no other cars, just the open road and the desert beyond. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "So, how far are we from town?" The man's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Not too far now." But the way he said it made my skin crawl. I reached for my phone, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally get a signal. But the screen still showed no service. My fingers trembled as I slipped the phone back into my pocket. We drove in silence for another few minutes, the tension in the cab growing thicker with every passing mile. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. "Hey, can you pull over?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. I think I left something in my car. Maybe I should go back in." Before I could finish, the man slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt, the tires skidding on the asphalt. I lurched forward in my seat, the seatbelt digging into my chest as I was thrown against it. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the soft rumble of the engine and my own ragged breathing. Then the man turned to me, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. "You're not going anywhere." My heart leapt into my throat as I fumbled with the door handle, trying desperately to get it open, but the handle wouldn't budge. I yanked at it, panic surging through me, but it was stuck locked from the outside. The man's hand shot out, grabbing my arm with a grip like iron. His fingers dug into my skin, and I cried out in pain. "You think you can just run off?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Not out here, kid. Not on my highway." I struggled against his grip, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. I had to. Suddenly, the truck door flew open, and I was yanked out of the cab, tumbling onto the hard asphalt. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I gasped for breath, my vision swimming as I scrambled to my feet. But before I could make a move, the man was on me. He grabbed me by the collar, slamming me against the side of the truck. I felt the cold metal of a knife press against my throat, the blade glinting in the dim light. "You shouldn't have gotten in," he hissed, his breath hot against my ear. I closed my eyes, my heart racing as I waited for the inevitable. But then, out of nowhere, a blinding light filled the highway, and the sound of a car horn blared through the night. The man froze, his grip loosening for just a moment. It was all I needed. I shoved him away, stumbling backward as I bolted down the highway, the headlights of the oncoming car growing brighter and brighter. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Behind me, I heard the man's truck roar to life, the engine growling as he sped off into the night, leaving me alone on the highway, gasping for breath. The car pulled up beside me, and a woman rolled down the window, her face pale with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, too shaken to speak. I had made it. It was the kind of night that seemed to drag on forever. The air was thick with the weight of an approaching storm, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows of my small, two-story house. The old wooden beams creaked in protest with every gust, and the leaves of the tall oak trees that surrounded my yard rustled like restless spirits. I had always loved living in this old house. It had a kind of charm that newer homes lacked, with its creaky floors and drafty windows. There was something comforting about its age, its history. But tonight, that comfort was slipping away, replaced by a growing sense of unease. I sat alone in my living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket wrapped around me. The soft glow of the lamp next to me cast long shadows across the room, and the flickering light from the television provided a steady hum of background noise. Outside, the wind picked up, howling louder now, like it was trying to break into the house. It was almost midnight, and I should have gone to bed hours ago, but something was keeping me awake. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that I wasn't really alone. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I lived alone in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road, and the only sounds I ever heard at night were the wind, the occasional rustling of the trees, and the distant hoot of an owl. But tonight was different. And I had just started to doze off when I heard the faint sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, knocking a branch against the side of the house. But as I sat up, straining to listen, I realized that it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the window behind me. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly turned to look. The window was mostly obscured by the thick curtains, but I could see just enough of the glass to make out a faint shape. Someone was standing outside. My breath caught in my throat. My first thought was that it must be a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the trees. But as I stared, my heart pounding in my chest, the shape moved. I froze, my mind racing. Who could it be? I lived in a quiet, rural area, and it was almost midnight. No one should be out here at this hour. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my fingers trembling as I checked for any missed calls or messages. Nothing. I stood up slowly, my eyes never leaving the window. The tapping started again, more insistent this time. It was the unmistakable sound of knuckles rapping against the glass. I took a step closer, my heart racing. Part of me wanted to fling open the curtains, to confront whoever or whatever was out there. But another part of me was too terrified to move. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a lost traveler, someone who had broken down and needed help? Or was it something far worse? I edged closer to the window, my hand reaching out for the curtain. The tapping stopped. Shra. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the fabric. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I could feel the cold sweat on my palms. Slowly, carefully, I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek through. And there, standing just inches from the glass, was a man. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see his eyes too dark, hollow pits staring straight at me. His breath fogged the glass as he stood perfectly still, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My hand slipped from the curtain, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the couch. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my racing heartbeat. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me through the window, his face inches from the glass. I backed away slowly, my hand reaching for my phone. I didn't take my eyes off the window, Didn't dare look away from the stranger standing just outside. My mind raced with fear and confusion. Who was he? What did he want? Why was he just standing there? I glanced down at my phone, my fingers shaking as I unlocked the screen. I dialed 911, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. The phone rang once, twice before a voice on the other end answered. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone outside my house, I whispered, my voice trembling. He's just standing there, staring through the window. Stay calm, the operator said, her voice steady and reassuring. Can you describe him? Is he trying to get inside? I glanced back at the window, but the man was gone. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. I rushed to the window, yanking the curtain back completely, but the yard was empty. The only thing I could see was the dark silhouette of the trees swaying in the wind, their branches scratching against the house. He's gone, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Gone, the operator repeated, her voice laced with concern. Are you sure? Could he still be hiding nearby? I don't know, I said, my voice shaking. He was just there, but now he's gone. Stay inside, she instructed. Lock all the doors and windows. We'll send a patrol car to check the area. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. My hands were shaking as I moved around the house, checking all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. Every creak, every groan of the house sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me, waiting. I double-checked the front door, twisting the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place. The house was small, and it didn't take long to check every entry point, but my nerves were on edge. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight now, and the storm was starting to pick up. The wind howled louder, and I could hear the distant rumble of thunder. The house felt smaller than ever. I paced back and forth in the living room, trying to calm myself down. Maybe he was just a lost hiker, someone who had wandered too far from the trail and ended up at my house by mistake. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I nearly dropped it in surprise. I glanced down, seeing a text message from the 911 dispatcher. The patrol car is 5 minutes away. Stay inside. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my nerves. 5 minutes? I could handle that. The police would arrive, they'd check the area, and everything would go back to normal. But the feeling of dread gnawed at me. Something wasn't right. I moved to the window again, peeking through the curtain. The yard was still empty, the trees swaying in the wind. But as I scanned the shadows, something caught my eye, a dark shape, just barely visible at the edge of the tree line. I squinted, trying to get a better look. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but there was definitely something there. A person. My heart skipped a beat as the figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows of the trees. It was him. The same man from before, standing just at the edge of the yard, watching me. His face was still hidden by the shadows, but his eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were fixed on me. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The police were on their way, but I wasn't sure if I could wait that long. I didn't know what this man wanted, but the way he looked at me, the way he just stood there in the darkness, it made my skin crawl. I heard a creak from somewhere in the house, and my heart nearly stopped. I spun around, my eyes darting to the hallway that led to the back door. Had I locked it? I rushed to the back of the house, my feet slipping on the hardwood floor as I skidded to a stop in front of the door. I reached for the deadbolt, my fingers trembling, but before I could lock it, the door burst open. The man was there. I stumbled backward, my mind racing with terror. He stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate. His face was still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. I backed away, my hands shaking as I fumbled for anything to defend myself. But the man didn't attack. He didn't rush toward me or say a word. He just stood there, in the middle of my living room, staring at me with those hollow eyes. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he spoke. "I'm already inside." My blood ran cold. The words echoed in my mind, and I realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity what he meant. This wasn't the first time he'd been here. He had been inside the house before. Maybe even watched me for days, maybe longer. The police sirens blared in the distance, cutting through the silence. The man's expression didn't change. He turned slowly, walking back toward the open door, and disappeared into the night. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The police arrived moments later, their lights flashing outside as they searched the property. They found no sign of the man, no trace that he had ever been there. But I knew the truth. He had been there, and he would be back. It all started when I moved into the old house. I had been looking for a place that was affordable and close to the city, and this house checked all the boxes. It was a bit run down, sure, but I figured I could fix it up over time. Besides, the rent was unbelievably cheap for a place this size. It felt like a good deal, a great deal, even. But there was one thing that felt off right from the start: the mirror. It was an old, ornate mirror that had been left behind by the previous owners. It hung in the upstairs hallway, right outside the bedroom, its heavy, gold frame tarnished with age. The glass was slightly warped, like it had seen too many years and too many reflections. The first time I saw it, something about it made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way it seemed to distort my reflection, or the way it was positioned directly across from the bedroom door, so that it was the first thing I saw every morning when I stepped out of my room. I thought about taking it down, but it was bolted to the wall in a way that made it difficult to remove without damaging the plaster. Besides, it seemed harmless enough. It was just a mirror after all. I told myself I was being silly, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But that feeling of unease never went away. The first few nights in the house were uneventful. I spent my days unpacking boxes, hanging curtains, and trying to make the place feel like home. At night, I would lie in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house settling, the wind rattling the windows. I chalked it up to the house's age. It was bound to have some quirks, right? Then, one night, something strange happened. I had just turned off the lights and crawled into bed when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was faint at first, a soft tapping sound, like fingers drumming against wood. I sat up, listening, my heart beginning to race. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone or something was knocking on the walls. I swung my legs out of bed, creeping toward the door. I opened it slowly, peering into the dark hallway. There was nothing there. Just the mirror, its surface glinting faintly in the dim light. The house was silent again, the tapping gone. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The mirror reflected the hallway, distorted as usual, but there was nothing unusual about it, no sign of anything out of place. With a shaky breath, I closed the door and crawled back into bed, telling myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a branch tapping against the window. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The tapping continued the next few nights. Always the same sound, always coming from the hallway. Every time I got up to check, the house would fall silent again, the mirror reflecting only the empty corridor. It was unnerving, but I told myself it was just a quirk of the house. Old houses made noises, after all. But then one night, the tapping stopped and something worse took its place. I had been lying in bed, listening to the wind howl outside, when I heard the floorboards creak just outside my door. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the usual groan of the house settling. This was deliberate, like the sound of footsteps. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The floorboards creaked again, louder this time, moving slowly down the hallway. My pulse quickened as I swung my legs out of bed, tiptoeing toward the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening intently. The footsteps stopped. I swallowed hard, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to see what might be out there, but I couldn't just stay in my room, paralyzed with fear. I took a deep breath and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. The mirror hung on the wall, its surface glinting faintly in the moonlight streaming through the window. The house was silent again, but the feeling of unease was stronger than ever. That's when I noticed it. My reflection in the mirror. At first, I thought it was just the usual distortion from the old glass, but as I stepped closer, I realized something was very wrong. My reflection wasn't just warped, it was off. The person staring back at me didn't move the way I did. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, and her eyes didn't match mine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My reflection stared back at me, her expression cold and emotionless. I took a step back, and she took a step forward. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind raced. This wasn't possible. It had to be some kind of trick, some kind of optical illusion. But as I stood there, staring at the mirror, my reflection tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as if she were studying me. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The woman in the mirror, because I was certain now that she wasn't me, watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared with those cold, lifeless eyes. I slammed the bedroom door shut, locking it behind me. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a frightened child. My mind was racing, my heart thudding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something was very wrong with that mirror. The next morning, I avoided the hallway altogether. I showered, got dressed, and left the house without so much as glancing at the mirror. But as I drove to work, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light, or maybe just a product of my tired mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. That night, the tapping started again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the mirror. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was soft at first, like fingers drumming against glass, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost deafening. I threw the covers off and stormed into the hallway, determined to confront whatever was happening. The mirror gleamed in the dim light, its surface reflecting the empty corridor. But as I stepped closer, I saw her again, the woman in the mirror. She was standing there, just inches from the glass, her face twisted into a cruel smile. Her eyes, cold and empty, locked onto mine. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if she were trying to break through the glass. My hands shook as I backed away, my mind racing with terror. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. But it was. The woman in the mirror reached out, her fingers pressing against the glass. The surface rippled beneath her touch, like water disturbed by a stone. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, frozen in place, as her hand pushed through the glass. I screamed, stumbling backward and crashing into the wall. The woman's hand clawed at the air, her fingers long and thin, her nails sharp like talons. She pushed further, her arm emerging from the mirror, the glass rippling and distorting as she pulled herself through. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing with panic. I had to get out of the house. I had to run, but as I turned to flee, I felt her cold, bony fingers wrap around my wrist. Her grip was like ice, freezing me in place. I tried to pull away, but she was stronger than she looked. Her other hand emerged from the mirror, and she stepped forward, her body halfway through the glass. I screamed again, thrashing wildly as I tried to break free, but she held on tight, her grip unrelenting. Her face twisted into a malicious grin, her eyes gleaming with malevolent delight. "You can't leave," she hissed, her voice a low, raspy whisper. "You belong to me now." I kicked at her, desperation fueling my every movement. My foot connected with her chest, and for a moment, her grip loosened. I tore free, stumbling backward and crashing into the bedroom door. I threw it open and bolted inside, slamming it shut behind me. The tapping started again, louder this time, as if she were pounding on the door. My heart raced as I backed away, my eyes locked on the doorknob. I could see the shadow of her hand reaching for it, her fingers clawing at the wood. I ran to the window, throwing it open and climbing out onto the roof. The wind whipped at my face, and the cold night air stung my skin, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I climbed down the side of the house, my hands scraping against the rough brick, and dropped to the ground below. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with terror. I looked back at the house, half expecting to see her standing in the window, watching me with those cold, lifeless eyes. But the house was dark, silent. I collapsed onto the curb, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I couldn't go back. I couldn't stay in that house, not with her. The next day, I packed my things and left. I never went back. I couldn't. The memory of that night still haunts me. The image of her twisted smile burned into my mind. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping. It was late, much later than I should have been driving, but I didn't have a choice. I was on my way back from visiting my parents, and I had severely underestimated how long the drive would take. My phone was dead, the radio was out of range, and I was left with nothing but the monotonous hum of the engine and the darkness of the open road stretching ahead. The highway was eerily empty. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the vast emptiness around me was unsettling. The only light came from my headlights, casting long beams that flickered across the cracked pavement. Beyond that, it was as if the world simply ceased to exist. The fields on either side of the road were swallowed by darkness, their outlines barely visible under the faint glow of the moon. I checked the dashboard. The gas gauge was dipping toward empty, and I mentally kicked myself for not filling up at the last station I passed. I wasn't sure when the next gas station would come up, and I couldn't afford to run out of fuel in the middle of nowhere. The last thing I wanted was to be stranded out here, alone in the dead of night. As if in response to my thoughts, the engine sputtered, my heart leaped into my throat, and I glanced down at the dashboard again. The gas light flickered on, mocking me with its bright yellow glow. Damn it, I muttered under my breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I scanned the horizon, hoping to spot a sign for a gas station or a rest stop, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of highway, the empty fields, and the oppressive darkness. The engine sputtered again, more violently this time, and I felt the car lurch forward before it slowed to a crawl. I cursed under my breath, my hands shaking as I steered the car to the side of the road. The engine died with a pitiful wheeze, and the car came to a stop on the shoulder. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the dashboard, my mind racing with frustration and fear. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not here. I tried turning the key in the ignition, but the engine only groaned in response, refusing to start. I slumped back in my seat, running a hand through my hair as I stared out at the dark, desolate highway. What now? I could wait and hope that another car would come by, but the chances of that happening seemed slim. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and the highway was notoriously quiet at night. My phone was completely dead, so calling for help was out of the question. I could walk, but I had no idea how far the next gas station or rest stop might be. I didn't even know which direction to head in. As I sat there, contemplating my options, I noticed something in the rearview mirror figure, standing on the side of the road, a few yards behind my car. My breath caught in my throat. Where had they come from? The figure was tall and slender, dressed in dark clothing that blended almost seamlessly with the night. I couldn't make out any details from this distance, but there was something unsettling about the way they stood there, so still, as if they had been watching me for some time. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to have disappeared, but they were still there, standing in the same spot. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Who the hell was that? And what were they doing out here in the middle of nowhere? I watched the figure for a moment longer, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just a hitchhiker, someone who had been walking along the highway and saw my car break down. Maybe they were stranded too, hoping for a ride. Or maybe it was something worse. My instincts screamed at me to stay in the car, to lock the doors and wait for help. But as I sat there staring at the figure in the mirror, I felt a strange sense of guilt creeping in. What if they really were just a stranded traveler, someone who needed help as much as I did? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I couldn't just leave them out there, not if they were in trouble. Reluctantly, I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling slightly. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night air. The highway was eerily silent, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the nearby fields. "Hey," I called out, my voice echoing unnervingly in the stillness. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. They didn't move, didn't react in any way. A chill ran down my spine. I took a cautious step forward, squinting into the darkness, trying to get a better look at them. They were still standing in the same spot, motionless, their face obscured by the shadows. "Do you need help?" I called out again, my voice faltering slightly. This time, the figure moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they took a step forward, their movements deliberate and measured. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a surge of unease wash over me. Something wasn't right. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure continued to approach, their footsteps eerily silent on the pavement. "I don't have any gas," I said, my voice trembling. "My car broke down too. I can't help you." The figure didn't stop. They kept walking, their dark silhouette growing larger as they drew closer. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my hand reaching for the car door. I yanked it open and scrambled back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stared out the window, my eyes wide with fear as the figure continued to approach the car. They were just a few yards away now, their face still hidden in the shadows. I could see the outline of their body, their long arms hanging limply at their sides, their gait unnaturally slow and deliberate. My heart raced as I watched them, my mind screaming at me to do something, to run, to hide, to get away. But I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure stopped beside the car, just outside the passenger window. For a moment, they stood there, unmoving, their face turned toward the glass. I couldn't see their features clearly, but I could feel their gaze on me, cold, unblinking, predatory. I held my breath, my body trembling with terror. What did they want? Why were they just standing there? Then, without warning, the figure raised a hand and tapped lightly on the window. The sound sent a jolt of fear through me, and I flinched, my heart skipping a beat. The tapping was soft, almost gentle, but there was something menacing about it, something that made my blood run cold. They tapped again, slower this time, their fingers lingering on the glass. I couldn't take it anymore. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached for the ignition, praying that the car would start. My fingers shook as I turned the key, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a shuddering groan, the engine sputtered to life. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The figure stepped closer, their hands still pressed against the window. I could see them more clearly now, the outline of their face, the dark, empty hollows where their eyes should have been. I screamed, slamming my foot down on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, the tires screeching on the pavement as I sped down the highway. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart racing. The figure was gone. For a moment, I thought I had escaped. I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The highway stretched out ahead of me, dark and empty, just as it had been before. But something was wrong. The car was moving, but I wasn't getting any farther. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, the same cracked pavement, the same empty fields. No matter how fast I drove, I wasn't making any progress. Panic surged through me again, and I pressed down harder on the gas pedal, willing the car to go faster. But the scenery remained the same, the road stretching out endlessly into the darkness. Then I saw it. The figure. They were standing in the middle of the road, directly in front of me, their dark silhouette illuminated by the headlights. I screamed, yanking the steering wheel to the side. The car swerved violently, the tires screeching as I veered off the road and into the field. The car skidded to a stop, the engine sputtering and dying once again. I sat there, trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was standing in front of the car, their empty eyes fixed on me, their face twisted into a cruel smile. I tried to move, to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure raised their hand again, tapping lightly on the hood of the car. Tap, tap, tap. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face, as the figure's voice echoed in the darkness. You can't escape. It was the last place I wanted to go down, into the basement. Basements had always unsettled me, and this one was no exception. The house I had moved into was old, with creaky floors and dim lighting, but it had been cheap and in a quiet neighborhood. As a young woman living alone, I had jumped at the opportunity for an affordable place, even if it had come with its quirks. The first couple of weeks had gone smoothly enough. I had settled in, unpacked most of my things, and was beginning to feel comfortable in my new home. The only part of the house I had avoided so far was the basement. It had a heavy, wooden door that sat flush with the floor, and the previous owner had warned me that the lock was a bit tricky. She'd mentioned that the basement was just for storage, and that I probably wouldn't need to go down there often. And for a while, I didn't. Until the night I heard the noise. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, but in the quiet stillness of the house, it stood out. I had been in the kitchen, making a cup of tea, When I heard it, a faint tapping, like knuckles lightly drumming on wood. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, straining to listen. The sound came again, a soft, rhythmic knock, and I realized it was coming from below from the basement. I set my mug down, my pulse quickening. My mind immediately raced to rational explanations. Maybe it was just the old pipes, or maybe something had fallen over down there. But as I stood in the kitchen, listening, the tapping persisted, steady and deliberate. I didn't want to go down there. I told myself I was being silly. There was nothing in the basement, just old boxes and furniture left behind by the previous owner. But the longer I listened, the more the sound unnerved me. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and made my way to the basement door. The old wood was cool under my fingers as I grasped the doorknob, the lock sticking slightly before it clicked open. The hinges creaked loudly as I pulled the door open, and a damp, musty smell wafted up from the darkness below. The stairs leading down were steep, and the light bulb bulb hanging from the ceiling at the top of the staircase barely illuminated the steps. I clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the inky blackness of the basement. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping had stopped the moment I opened the door, and the sudden silence made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I steeled myself and descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The flashlight beam bounced off the stone walls, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move with every step I took. The air was damp and cold, and the basement felt like a completely different world compared to the rest of the house, darker, heavier. I reached the bottom of the stairs and swept the flashlight across the room. It was just as I remembered, old boxes stacked against the walls, an unused washing machine in one corner, and an assortment of random junk scattered across the floor. Nothing out of the ordinary. I exhaled, relieved. I had been letting my imagination get the best of me. There was nothing here, just the creaks and groans of an old house, settling in the night. But as I turned to go back upstairs, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, the sound was louder, more distinct, like something was knocking on wood just a few feet away. My heart pounded in my chest, and I swung the flashlight toward the source of the noise. There, in the far corner of the basement, was an old wooden door. I hadn't noticed it before it was hidden behind a stack of boxes, the wood warped and weathered with age. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, as if it had been left that way intentionally. The tapping came again, from the other side of the door. I swallowed hard, my hand shaking as I aimed the flashlight at the door. There was no reason for there to be another room in the basement. The real estate agent hadn't mentioned anything about it, and I had assumed the basement was just one large, open space. I took a step closer, my breath catching in my throat. The door creaked as it moved slightly, as if something on the other side had pushed against it. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I should have turned back. I should have gone upstairs, locked the basement door behind me, and forgotten about the noise. But something pulled me toward that old, creaky door, something I couldn't explain. I reached out with trembling fingers, grasping the edge of the door. The wood was rough under my touch, and it moved easily as I pulled it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond the door was small, barely more than a closet, and completely empty except for one thing, a wooden box, sitting in the center of the floor. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest. The box was old, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs, and it was small enough to fit in my lap. There was something unsettling about the way it just sat there, perfectly centered in the room, as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't leave it there either. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the room, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I knelt down beside the box, shining the flashlight on its surface. There were no markings, no lock, nothing to indicate what might be inside. My fingers itched to open it, but I hesitated, fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. What if whatever had been making the tapping noise was inside the box? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I pulled my hand back. I didn't need to open it. I could just leave it here, close the door, and pretend I had never seen it. But something about the box called to me, like it was daring me to open it, to see what was inside. My heart raced as I reached for the lid, my fingers trembling. Slowly I lifted it, the wood creaking as it opened. Inside the box was a single object, a small, ornate key. I stared at it, my mind racing. The key was old, made of tarnished brass, and it lay on a piece of faded velvet. There was something disturbingly familiar about it, though I couldn't place where I had seen it before. I reached into the box, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the key. As soon as I touched it, a wave of nausea washed over me, and I jerked my hand back, stumbling to my feet. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the shadows stretching and shifting with unnatural movement. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, and I slammed the door shut behind me. I ran up the stairs, my breath coming in short, panic gasps as I bolted back into the kitchen. I slammed the basement door shut, locking it with shaking hands. I stood there, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced with fear and confusion. What had just happened? What was that key, and why had it made me feel so sick? I glanced down at my hand, half expecting to see something there, but it was empty. I hadn't taken the key with me, had I? I shook my head, trying to calm myself down. It was just a key, an old, forgotten key. There was no reason for it to have had such an effect on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something about that box, about that room, about the tapping, it wasn't normal. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the tapping again, faint but persistent, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the house. The next day, I called a locksmith and had the basement door replaced with a heavy steel one. I had it reinforced with multiple locks, making sure it was as secure as possible. I couldn't bear the thought of going down there again, of hearing that tapping, of seeing that box. For weeks, I avoided the basement entirely. I didn't even want to be in the same room as the door. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the tapping never stopped. It was always there, just at the edge of my hearing, like a faint heartbeat pulsing through the walls of the house. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of footsteps coming from the basement. They were soft at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind rattling the windows. But as I lay there, frozen in fear, the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. They climbed the stairs slowly, methodically, until they stopped just outside my bedroom door. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The room was deathly silent, the air thick with tension. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I screamed, bolting out of bed and rushing to the door. I threw it open, expecting to see something standing there. But the hallway was empty. My heart raced as I backed away, my mind spinning with terror. The house was silent again, but I knew deep down that I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure what was happening or why, but one thing was clear. I had made a terrible mistake by opening that box. I never liked the attic. From the day I moved into this house, something about it felt off. The rest of the house was charming, if a little old-fashioned, with its creaky hardwood floors and tall, narrow windows. But the attic, something about it made me feel uneasy. It was a large, dusty space filled with old trunks and forgotten furniture from previous tenants. The ceiling sloped down low on either side, and a single bare light bulb hung from the rafters, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The first time I had gone up there, I had been hit by the overwhelming smell of dust and mold. I hadn't spent long up there, just enough time to store a few boxes of my own things. For the most part, I had no reason to go back. At least until I started hearing the noises. It started off subtle, a faint creaking like wood shifting under pressure, or the soft scuff of something brushing against the walls. I had told myself it was nothing more than the house settling, the usual sounds of an old building breathing and groaning as it aged. But as the days went by, the noises grew louder, more distinct. I could hear it at night, especially when the rest of the house was quiet. A shuffle, a faint scraping, as if something was being dragged across the floorboards. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was my imagination, but one night as I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, I heard something unmistakable, a series of slow, deliberate footsteps right above me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat up in bed listening. The footsteps continued, steady and measured, like someone or something was walking across the attic floor. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Who could possibly be up there? I lived alone. I had never given anyone a spare key, and the attic only had one entrance, the small hatch at the top of the narrow staircase. There was no way someone could be up there without me knowing. But as I sat there frozen in fear, the footsteps grew louder. There was no mistaking it. Someone was in the attic. I got out of bed slowly, my heart racing, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. My fingers shook as I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered almost immediately, her voice calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in my attic, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I can hear them walking around. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Are you sure there's someone there? Could it be an animal? No, I said, my voice shaking. It's footsteps. I can hear them walking. All right, the dispatcher said, her tone soothing. I'm sending a patrol car to your location. Stay on the line with me until they arrive. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and sat down on the edge of the bed, clutching the phone tightly in my hand. The footsteps had stopped, and the house was eerily quiet again. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence was worse than the noise. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, answering her questions in a shaky voice. I kept glancing at the ceiling, half expecting to see it cave in under the weight of whatever was up there, but nothing happened. The footsteps didn't return. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, and a few moments later there was a knock at the door. I raced downstairs, grateful for the distraction, and opened the door to find two police officers standing on the porch. One of them was tall and broad-shouldered with a stern expression. The other was younger, his face soft and kind. They both greeted me with a nod, their hands resting on the handles of their flashlights. You said you heard someone in the attic, the taller officer asked, his voice low. I nodded, my hands shaking as I stepped aside to let them in. Yes, I heard footsteps. It sounded like someone was walking around up there. The younger officer exchanged a glance with his partner before turning back to me. Have you checked the attic yourself? I shook my head. No, I was too scared. All right, the taller officer said, his tone calm but firm. We'll check it out. You wait down here. They made their way toward the staircase, their flashlights cutting through the dim light of the hallway. I stayed at the bottom of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest as they ascended into the attic. For a few minutes, I could hear them moving around up there, their footsteps echoing through the house. They called out a few times, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I held my breath, waiting for them to come back down with news, good or bad. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they returned. The taller officer shook his head, his expression unreadable. There's no one up there. We checked the whole attic. I blinked, confusion and fear swirling in my mind, but I heard footsteps. I swear I did. The younger officer gave me a sympathetic look. It's an old house. Sometimes these places make strange noises. It could have been the wind or the house settling. I wanted to argue, to insist that what I had heard was real, but I could tell they didn't believe me. To them, it was just another false alarm, a nervous homeowner imagining things. They assured me the house was secure and offered to stay for a little while longer, but I declined. I didn't want to seem like a burden. After they left, I locked all the doors and windows and returned to my bedroom, though sleep was out of the question. The footsteps didn't come back that night. In fact, I didn't hear anything unusual for the next several days. I started to think that maybe the officers had been right, that it was just the house settling, or maybe a small animal scurrying around in the attic. I tried to put the incident behind me, telling myself that I had overreacted. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A week later, it happened again. I had been sitting in the living room, reading a book, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps overhead. This time they were louder, more deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as I listened to the slow, steady steps moving across the attic floor. They stopped, directly above me. I stared up at the ceiling, my breath catching in my throat. I knew, without a doubt, that someone was up there. But this time, I didn't call the police. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and made my way toward the staircase. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to know. The staircase creaked under my weight as I climbed toward the attic, each step sending a jolt of fear through me. The air grew colder the higher I went, and by the time I reached the top, my breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring at the attic door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my fingers trembling. For a moment, I considered turning back, locking the door, and pretending this had never happened. but I couldn't. I needed to know the truth. I turned the knob slowly, the old wood creaking as the door swung open. The attic was just as I remembered it, dark, dusty, and filled with old, forgotten things. The bare light bulb flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I swept it across the space. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone, just the same old trunks and boxes gathering dust in the corners. But then I saw it. I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, partially hidden behind a stack of old furniture, was a door. A small, wooden door that I had never noticed before. My heart skipped a beat. How had I missed it? I had been in the attic before, and I was certain that door hadn't been there. But there it was, plain as day. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The door was small, too small for a person to fit through, but it was unmistakably a door. The wood was old and warped, the paint peeling away in places, but it looked like it had been used recently. The handle was smooth, worn down from years of use. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what was on the other side. But I couldn't turn back now. Slowly I reached for the handle and twisted it. The door creaked as it opened, the hinges groaning in protest. Behind the door was a narrow passageway, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. It was dark, the air cold and stale, and the smell of dampness filled my nostrils. I shone my flashlight down the passage, but it seemed to stretch on endlessly, disappearing into the darkness. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. I knew I should turn back, lock the attic door, and forget about this, but something compelled me to move forward. I stepped into the passageway, the walls pressing in on either side. The floor was uneven, and I stumbled as I made my way deeper into the darkness. The air grew colder, and the sound of my footsteps echoed eerily in the narrow space. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the passage. There, standing in the darkness, was a man. He was tall and thin, his clothes old and tattered, his face gaunt and hollow. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring straight ahead, unblinking. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my heart racing with terror. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the darkness, his chest rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my bedroom, the door locked behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with fear and confusion. I never went back into the attic after that night. I couldn't. The memory of the man standing in the darkness haunts me to this day. I don't know who he was or why he was there, but I do know one thing. The attic wasn't empty. It never was. I wasn't supposed to be out that far, but curiosity had gotten the better of me. It was a late summer afternoon, the air hot and still, with the scent of pine and dry earth hanging thick in the air. I had been hiking alone through the woods behind my new house, something I did often to clear my head. I loved the quiet, the way the world seemed to disappear when you were deep enough in the forest. But that day, I had wandered further than usual, venturing into parts of the woods I hadn't explored before. I wasn't worried, at least, not at first. I had a good sense of direction, and the sun was still high in the sky. I figured I'd be back home before it got dark. That's when I saw it. The cabin. And it was tucked away between the trees, almost hidden from sight. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't tripped on a gnarled root and fallen to the ground. As I brushed the dirt from my knees and stood up, I spotted the roof of the cabin, barely visible through the thick foliage. It looked old. Abandoned. I should have turned around right then and there. I should have taken it as a sign that I'd wandered too far. But instead, I felt a strange pull, a curiosity that I couldn't ignore. I made my way toward the cabin, the underbrush crunching beneath my boots as I pushed through the trees. The closer I got, the more decrepit the cabin appeared. The wooden planks that made up the walls were weathered and rotting, the roof sagging in places. The windows were dark, their glass cracked and smeared with dirt. Vines had grown up the sides of the building, curling around the structure like the forest itself was trying to reclaim it. I stopped a few feet away, staring at the cabin with a mix of awe and unease. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. I couldn't imagine anyone living out here, so far from civilization. Still, something about the place intrigued me. I wanted to see inside. I stepped closer, my heart beating a little faster as I approached the front door. It was partially open, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. I reached out and pushed it the rest of the way, the door creaking loudly as it swung inward. The interior of the cabin was even worse than I had expected. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. A few pieces of broken furniture were scattered across the floor, a table with one leg missing, an old chair tipped over on its side. The air was thick and stale, the musty smell of decay almost overwhelming. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. My skin prickled with unease, but I ignored it. There was something oddly fascinating about the place, like I had stumbled upon a piece of history that had been forgotten by the world. As I moved further into the cabin, I noticed something strange. There was no sign of animal activity, no nests, no chewed up furniture, no tracks in the dust. It was as if the cabin had been sealed off from the rest of the world, untouched for years. I wandered into what must have once been the living room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened with soot. Above the fireplace, a heavy wooden mantle was covered in dust, but something caught my eye, a small object, barely visible beneath the layer of grime. I approached it, wiping the dust away with my sleeve. It was a photograph, yellowed with age, the edges curled. I picked it up carefully, squinting at the faded image. It was a family, a man, a woman, and a young boy, all standing in front of the cabin. They were smiling, but there was something off about the photo. The faces were blurred, almost as if the image had been distorted over time. I flipped it over, hoping to find some sort of date or inscription, but the back of the photo was blank. I set the photograph down, a strange sense of unease creeping over me. I wasn't sure why, but something about the cabin didn't feel right. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I decided it was time to leave. As I turned to go, I heard a sound, faint at first, but unmistakable, a soft creaking like the sound of footsteps on old floorboards. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was coming from above me. The attic? I hadn't noticed the trapdoor in the ceiling when I first entered, but now it seemed to loom over me, the small square panel of wood barely holding together. I stared up at it, my breath catching in my throat as the creaking continued, slow and deliberate. Someone or something was up there? Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get out of the cabin and never look back. But my feet were rooted to the spot, my mind racing with fear and curiosity. Suddenly, the creaking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the air in the cabin thick with tension. I stared up at the trapdoor, waiting, listening. Then, with a loud crack, the door swung open. I stumbled back, my heart leaping into my throat. The trapdoor hung open, the darkness of the attic yawning above me like a gaping mouth. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I saw it. A face. It appeared at the edge of the opening, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that gleamed in the dim light. The skin was stretched tight over the bones as if the person or thing hadn't eaten in weeks, maybe months. Its lips were thin and cracked, pulled back in a grotesque smile. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stand there, frozen in terror, as the face stared down at me, unblinking. Slowly, it began to descend. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The thing moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its long, thin arms reaching for the edge of the trapdoor as it pulled itself down. I finally regained control of my legs and bolted for the door. I crashed through the doorway, the old wooden door slamming against the wall as I ran outside. I didn't stop to look back. I couldn't. I sprinted through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the trees closing in around me. My legs burned, but I kept running, pushing myself harder and harder. I didn't know if it was following me. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I reached the edge of the woods, my house coming into view. I stumbled onto the front porch, gasping for breath, and slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I collapsed onto the floor, my heart racing, my body shaking with fear. For a long time, I just sat there trying to catch my breath, trying to convince myself that what I had seen wasn't real. But deep down, I knew it was. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the house sent a jolt of fear through me, and I found myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see that face staring back at me from the darkness. The next morning, I made a decision. I had to go back. It was stupid. I knew that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, that I had unfinished business with that cabin. I needed to know what was up there, in the attic. I needed to know who or what I had seen. So, despite my fear, I packed a bag and headed back into the woods. The cabin was exactly as I had left it, the door still hanging crookedly on its hinges. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before stepping inside. The air was thick and musty, just as it had been before. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the cracked windows. The cabin was silent, save for the faint creaking of the old wooden beams. I made my way toward the living room, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The photograph was still there, sitting on the mantel, untouched. I stared up at the trapdoor in the ceiling, my stomach twisting with fear. It was closed now, just as it had been when I first entered, but I knew that something was up there. I took a deep breath and grabbed the rope that hung from the trapdoor. My hands shook as I pulled it open, the door creaking loudly as it swung downward. The darkness of the attic loomed above me, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows. My heart raced, but I forced myself to climb the ladder, each rung groaning under my weight. When I reached the top, I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the small, dirty window at the far end of the room. I couldn't see much, just the vague shapes of old furniture and boxes piled high against the walls. But then I saw it. In the corner of the attic, crouched on the floor, was the thing I had seen before. It was huddled in the shadows, its gaunt face turned toward me, its hollow eyes watching my every move. Its thin, bony fingers clutched a tattered piece of fabric, an old, faded blanket. I stared at it, my mind racing with fear and confusion. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just sat there, staring at me with those cold, empty eyes. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, it spoke. Help me. It was a cold, moonless night when I found myself walking alone down a dark, empty road. I had gone to a friend's party, and things had gotten a little out of hand. By the time I left, it was well past midnight, and I was more than a little buzzed from the drinks I'd had. I didn't have my car with me. I had thought it'd be a good idea to leave it at home, just in case things went too far. Now, though, I was regretting that decision. The street was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel under my feet. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, disappearing into the darkness. There were no streetlights, no passing cars, just the inky black sky and the faint outlines of trees on either side of the road. The cold air bit at my skin, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around me, trying to block out the chill. I wasn't scared, not really. I'd grown up in this town and I knew these roads well, but there was something about the night that felt different. The silence was too heavy, the darkness too complete. It felt like I was the only person in the world, like the rest of the town had vanished into the night. I pulled my phone from my pocket, hoping to call a ride, but the screen blinked with the dreaded no-signal message. I sighed, stuffing it back into my jacket. I was going to have to walk the whole way home. I kept my head down, my feet moving in a steady rhythm as I made my way down the road. I was maybe 2 miles from my house, and at this pace, it wouldn't take me more than half an hour to get there. I just had to keep walking, keep my mind off the growing sense of unease creeping into my chest. As I walked, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees. The sound was soft at first, just a gentle whisper, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like the trees themselves were alive, swaying and groaning in the darkness. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the eerie feeling that had settled over me. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But as I continued walking, they grew louder, more distinct. The steady tap, tap, tap of shoes on pavement echoed behind me, keeping time with my own steps. I stopped. The footsteps stopped too. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, listening intently. The wind howled through the trees, but there were no more footsteps. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the wind or the sound of my own footsteps bouncing off the trees. But as soon as I started walking again, the footsteps returned. Tap, tap, tap. My pulse quickened, and I resisted the urge to turn around. The footsteps were getting closer, their pace matching mine. Someone was following me. I could feel it. I stopped again, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped too, just a beat after mine. The silence pressed in on me, the darkness feeling even heavier than before. This time, I turned around. There was no one there. The road stretched out behind me, empty and silent. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches casting long, crooked shadows on the pavement. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the darkness, my eyes straining to see anything that would explain the sound. But there was nothing. I swallowed hard, my heart still racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the silence and the darkness were playing tricks on me. There was no one following me. I was alone. I turned back toward the road and started walking again, my footsteps quickening as I tried to put as much distance between myself and that feeling as possible. But the footsteps followed. This time, they were louder, faster, closer. I broke into a run. I sprinted down the road, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps pounded behind me, keeping pace with my own, growing louder and louder with every step. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my legs burning, my lungs aching as I pushed myself harder and harder. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, the darkness closing in around me like a suffocating blanket. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint glow of a streetlight up ahead. My house was just beyond that, only a few hundred feet away. I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in protest as I sprinted toward the light. The footsteps were right behind me now, so close I could almost feel the breath of whoever or whatever was chasing me. I reached the streetlight, my lungs burning as I skidded to a stop. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, something, standing there in the darkness. But there was no one. The road was empty, silent. The only sound was the wind rustling the trees and my own ragged breathing. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. My entire body shook with adrenaline, and I felt like my heart was about to explode out of my chest. I kept glancing down the road, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. But the road remained empty. I stood there for a few moments longer, my heart slowly calming, before I turned and started walking toward my house. My legs felt like lead, every step heavy and sluggish. The streetlight flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow on the pavement. As I approached my front door, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I had made it. Whatever had been following me, if it had even been real, was gone. I fumbled with my keys, my hands still shaking as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was dark and quiet, just as I had left it. I locked the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment as I tried to shake off the lingering fear. I was home. I was safe. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I stood there in the entryway, my breath coming in slow, steady gasps as I listened to the silence. The house creaked softly in the darkness, the old wood settling as it always did. But something felt off. Wrong. I turned on the light, the soft glow flooding the room and casting away the shadows. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the familiar space. Everything was exactly as it should be, my shoes by the door, my coat hanging on the hook, the old armchair in the corner. But the feeling persisted. I walked through the house, turning on every light as I went. The kitchen was empty. The living room was silent. The hallway was still. There was no one here. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. I made my way to the bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tightly over the windows. I flipped on the light and let out a long, shaky breath. The bed was unmade, just as I had left it. My clothes were strewn across the floor, and my phone charger sat tangled on the nightstand. Everything was normal. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling as I tried to calm myself. I glanced at my phone, hoping to distract myself with some mindless scrolling, but it was still dead. I sighed, tossing it onto the bed. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, and I knew it would be a long time before I'd be able to sleep. And then I heard it. The footsteps. They were faint, coming from somewhere inside the house. My blood turned to ice, and I sat up, my heart racing. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving through the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, my mind racing with fear. I had locked the door when I came in. No one could have followed me inside. Could they? The footsteps grew louder, closer. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp from the nightstand, and held it tightly in my hands, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. I stared at the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps, waiting. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I let out a scream, leaping off the bed and rushing toward the door. I slammed it shut just as the doorknob twisted fully, my body trembling with fear as I pressed my weight against the door. The footsteps retreated, moving back down the hallway, slow and deliberate. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as I clutched the doorknob. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The house was silent again. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. The forest had always seemed inviting to me, with its towering trees and the soft, moss-covered floor. It was a place where I could escape from the stress of everyday life, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the breeze and the distant calls of birds. It was peaceful, calming, until the day it wasn't. It started as a simple hike, something I did every weekend. I'd pack a lunch, lace up my boots, and spend the day wandering through the woods, exploring new trails and losing myself in the natural beauty of the forest. But this time, something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. The usual sounds of birds and animals were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. The trees, once comforting in their towering grandeur, now seemed to loom over me, their branches twisting and reaching out like skeletal arms. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I had been hiking these woods for years. There was nothing to be afraid of. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the dense underbrush for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the same silent trees stretching out endlessly in every direction. I took a deep breath and pressed on, my boots crunching softly against the fallen leaves. The trail was familiar, one I had walked many times before, but today it felt foreign, unwelcoming. After about an hour of hiking, I reached a small clearing that I often used as a resting spot. The sun filtered down through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I sat down on a large rock, pulling out my water bottle and taking a long drink. The cold water soothed my dry throat, and for a moment I allowed myself to relax. But then I heard it. A faint whispering sound, barely audible, carried on the breeze. It was so soft at first that I thought I was imagining it, but as I sat there, listening, it grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, or maybe voices whispering from somewhere deep within the forest. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The trees stood silent and still, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more urgent. My pulse quickened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something unnatural about the sound, something that didn't belong in these woods. I stuffed my water bottle back into my bag, my hands trembling slightly, and started walking again, faster this time. I needed to get out of the clearing, to put some distance between myself and whatever was making that noise. But as I walked, the whispering followed me. It was faint at first, like the wind moving through the trees, but it grew louder with every step I took. The words were impossible to make out, just a jumble of soft, hissing sounds, but there was a strange rhythm to them, as if they were trying to tell me something. I picked up my pace, my heart racing. The whispering seemed to come from all around me now, echoing through the trees, filling the air with a low, sinister hum. The forest, once my sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The trees crowded in on me, their branches twisting and creaking as if they were alive, watching me, whispering to me. I broke into a run. And the path twisted and turned, the underbrush growing thicker, snagging at my clothes as I tried to push my way through. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, the voices overlapping, growing into a cacophony of sound that filled my ears and drowned out my thoughts. I stumbled over a root, crashing to the ground, my hands scraping against the rougher bark of a fallen tree. The whispering was deafening now, surrounding me, pressing in on me from all sides. I scrambled to my feet, panic surging through me as I bolted down the trail, desperate to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, the voices followed. I didn't know how long I had been running. My lungs burned and my legs ached with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let the voices catch up to me. The trail had long since disappeared, and I found myself weaving between trees, the forest growing darker and more twisted with every step. The whispering was everywhere now, so loud that it felt like it was inside my head, the voices pressing against my mind, demanding my attention. And then, suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was so abrupt, so complete, that I stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath. The forest was deathly still, the air heavy with an unnatural quiet. I stood there, trembling, my heart pounding in my chest, listening for any sound, any sign that the voices were still there. But there was nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The silence was unsettling, but it was better than the whispering. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but the trees all looked the same. I had no idea where I was or how far I had strayed from the trail. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest for any familiar landmarks. The trees were thick and gnarled, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The ground was uneven, covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a tree, a tall, dark silhouette barely visible through the thick foliage. But as I stared, my blood turned to ice. The figure was too still, too human. It was watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my heart racing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me from the shadows, its face obscured by the darkness. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure took a step forward, the faint crunch of leaves under its feet the only sound in the otherwise silent forest. I took another step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure moved closer, its outline becoming clearer as it stepped into the dim light filtering through the trees. It was a man, tall, gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to stare straight through me. His clothes were tattered and worn, hanging loosely from his thin frame. He didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching me with those empty eyes. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root, and I fell to the ground. The man took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing with terror, and bolted into the trees. The forest closed in around me as I ran, the branches clawing at my skin, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath my feet. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel him behind me, his presence like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. The whispering had returned, faint at first, but growing louder with every step I took. The voices were frantic now, overlapping and intertwining, their words still impossible to understand but filled with an unmistakable urgency. I ran harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The trees blurred around me, their twisted shapes becoming indistinct as I raced through the forest. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, the voices pressing against my mind, pushing me forward. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I needed to escape. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me. I tumbled down a steep hill, the world spinning around me as I crashed through the underbrush. The branches scratched at my skin, tearing at my clothes as I rolled to the bottom. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath, my body aching from the fall. The whispering had stopped again, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, my vision swimming as I tried to get my bearings. The forest was dark and still, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. I had no idea where I was, no idea how far I had run. But the figure was gone. I exhaled shakily, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I was alone. The man, whoever he was, hadn't followed me. I was safe. I forced myself to my feet, my legs unsteady as I took a few tentative steps. The ground was uneven, the forest dense and unfamiliar, but I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving, had to find my way back to the trail. As I started walking, the whispering returned. It was faint, just a soft murmur carried on the breeze, but it was there, echoing through the trees, filling the air with its strange, otherworldly hum. I quickened my pace, my heart racing in my chest. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, the voices overlapping in a frantic, desperate chorus. I broke into a run. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted through the trees, the voices growing louder and louder until they were deafening, filling my head with their frantic whispers. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the voices stopped. I stumbled to a halt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest was silent again, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. I looked around, my pulse racing. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The forest was still, quiet, but I wasn't alone. I mustn't alone. The figure was there, standing just a few feet away, its hollow eyes fixed on me. And this time, it wasn't alone. It started with a faint scratching. I noticed it late one night while lying in bed, just on the edge of sleep. At first, I thought it was nothing more than the house-settling old buildings like mine often groaned and creaked with the weight of their years. But this sound was different. It was persistent, coming from somewhere within the walls. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was mice or maybe a squirrel trapped in the attic. But as the days went by, the scratching continued. It always seemed to start late at night, when the rest of the world had fallen silent. And it always came from the same spot behind the wall, near the foot of my bed. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a harmless animal, but something about the sound unsettled me. It wasn't just scratching, it was something more. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I pushed it away. There had to be a logical explanation. Still, the noise persisted. One night, after hours of lying awake, listening to the faint scratching, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and a small hammer, determined to find the source of the sound. I climbed into the attic, the air up there thick with dust and the smell of old wood. My footsteps echoed off the wooden beams as I made my way across the narrow space, shining the flashlight along the rafters. There was nothing. No nests, no signs of animal activity, no indication of anything living up here. I crouched down, running my hand along the floorboards, searching for any gaps or cracks where a mouse or squirrel might have gotten in, but everything seemed intact. I stood up, frustration and confusion gnawing at me. I knew I had heard something. There had to be something in the walls. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. The scratching. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from beneath the floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, the same soft, rhythmic tapping I had heard in my bedroom. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the floor, straining to listen. The sound grew louder. I pulled back, my breath catching in my throat. There was something down there, something under the house. I hurried back down the attic stairs, my mind racing. I had lived in this house for years, and I had never heard anything like this before. It didn't make sense. What could possibly be beneath the house? That night, I couldn't sleep. The scratching continued, a constant, maddening sound that echoed through the walls. I tossed and turned, pulling the covers over my head, but it didn't help. The noise was relentless, burrowing into my mind like an insect crawling under my skin. The next morning, I called an exterminator. I didn't tell him about the tapping, just that I thought I might have mice or something in the walls. He arrived later that afternoon, a stocky man with a thick beard and a tool belt slung around his waist. He spent hours inspecting the house, checking every corner, every crack, every possible entry point. He climbed into the attic, crawled under the house, even took a flashlight to the basement. But when he finally emerged, his face was grim. "There's nothing here," he said, wiping his hands on his pants. No signs of mice, rats, or any other kind of infestation. I stared at him, my mind spinning. But I can hear something. Every night. Scratching, tapping, there's something in the walls. The exterminator frowned, glancing around the room as if he could hear it too. Could be the pipes, or maybe the wind. Old houses like this, they make a lot of noise. I didn't argue. There was no point. He didn't believe me. But I knew what I had heard. I knew there was something in the walls. The exterminator left, and I was alone again, the house feeling larger and emptier than ever. That night, as I lay in bed, The scratching returned, louder this time, more insistent. I sat up, my heart racing. It wasn't just scratching, it was a voice. A soft, whispering voice, muffled by the walls but unmistakable. I strained to listen, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was faint, but I could hear it like someone was trapped inside the walls, trying to speak to me. My blood ran cold. I leaped out of bed, grabbing the flashlight and rushing to the wall where the sound was coming from. I pressed my ear against the plaster, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice grew louder, a soft, desperate whisper, like someone was pleading with me. Help me. I stumbled back, my hand shaking. It wasn't possible. There was no one in the walls. There couldn't be. But the voice persisted, growing louder, more frantic. I grabbed the hammer from the drawer and swung it at the wall. The plaster cracked and crumbled under the blow, revealing the wooden beams beneath. I swung again, harder this time, tearing a hole in the wall. Dust and debris filled the air as I hacked at the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Finally, I stepped back, staring at the hole I had made. There was nothing behind it, just empty space and the cold, bare wood of the house's framework. But the voice was still there. It was coming from deeper inside the walls, echoing through the house, filling every room with its desperate plea. Help me, please. I backed away, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police. I couldn't tell anyone. They would think I was crazy. Maybe I was. The next few nights were unbearable. The voice grew louder, more insistent, whispering to me through the walls, begging for help. It followed me everywhere, in the kitchen, in the living room, even in the bathroom. No matter where I went in the house, the voice was there, always just out of reach, always pleading. I started to lose sleep. The voice haunted me, even in my dreams. I could hear it, echoing in my mind, growing louder and louder until it was all I could think about. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the hammer again and went to the basement. The voice was louder down here, reverberating off the stone walls, filling the small, cramped space with its desperate whispers. Help me. Let me out. I swung the hammer at the wall, the sound of the impact echoing through the basement. The stone crumbled under the blow, revealing a small, dark space behind the wall. I shone the flashlight inside, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I couldn't see anything, just darkness. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw it. A door. It was old, made of dark, rotting wood, barely visible in the dim light. The edges were worn and cracked, and there were deep scratches etched into the surface, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my mind racing. There was no reason for a door to be here. No reason for there to be anything behind the wall. But the voice was louder now, so close that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. Help me. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grasped the doorknob. The metal was cold under my fingers, and for a moment, I hesitated. Something inside me screamed to turn back, to leave this place and never come back. But I couldn't. I turned the knob, the door creaking as it swung open. The smell hit me first, damp, musty, and something else, something rotten. I stepped back, shining the flashlight into the small, cramped room beyond the door. The walls were lined with old, decaying wood, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. In the corner of the room, something moved. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as a figure slowly emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, thin, gaunt, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her hair was long and matted, hanging limply around her face, and her eyes were wide, hollow, staring at me with a desperate intensity. She opened her mouth, and the words that had haunted me for weeks spilled out in a soft, rasping whisper. Help me. I stumbled back, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. How could she have been here all this time, trapped behind the walls? The woman took a step forward, her eyes locked on mine, her voice growing more frantic. Help me. Let me out. I backed away, my hands trembling, and the flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the woman, her hollow eyes staring into mine, her voice echoing in the small, suffocating space. "Let me out." The house was old, much older than I had originally thought. It had been a steal, honestly an old Victorian-style house on the edge of town, priced far below market value. I should have wondered why it was so cheap, but at the time I was too excited about the idea of owning such a beautiful historic home. The realtor had been vague about the house's past, mentioning only that it had stood empty for years after the last owner had passed away. I didn't think much of it at the time. Old houses came with stories after all. The first few weeks in the house were magical. I loved the high ceilings, the ornate woodwork, and the large bay windows that let in streams of sunlight during the day. There was something comforting about the creak of the floorboards and the smell of old wood that made the place feel like it had a soul. I spent my days unpacking, restoring some of the original features, and slowly making the house my own. But then I found the room. I hadn't noticed it at first. It was tucked away at the end of a long hallway on the second floor, hidden behind a heavy wooden door that blended into the dark paneling. I only discovered it by accident one afternoon while I was cleaning. I had been wiping down the hallway walls, marveling at the intricate carvings in the wood, when my hand brushed against a small latch that I hadn't noticed before. The latch clicked, and the door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase leading up to what I assumed was the attic. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the stairs, the air growing cooler and mustier the higher I climbed. The staircase was steep, the steps narrow, and the wood creaked ominously under my weight. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I reached the top, illuminating a small, narrow door at the end of the hallway. The door was unlike the others in the house. It was plain, almost crude, with no handle, just a small circular hole where a knob might have once been. The wood was rough, splintered in places, and the paint had long since faded away. There was something about the door that unsettled me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether I should turn back, but the thought of leaving the door unopened gnawed at me, and before I knew it, I was reaching out, pushing it open. The door creaked loudly as it swung inward, revealing a small, forgotten room. The room was bare, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust. The walls were a faded, peeling yellow, and the only light came from a single, grimy window at the far end of the room. It was a strange space, too small to be a bedroom, too large to be a closet. There was nothing inside except for an old wooden chair that sat in the center of the room, facing the window. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something about the room that felt wrong, as if it had been untouched for years, maybe even decades. The air was thick and heavy, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. I walked over to the window, wiping away the grime with my sleeve. Outside, the view was of the backyard, overgrown and wild, with tall grass and dense trees that seemed to crowd in on the house. I turned back to the chair, my stomach twisting with unease. Who had been in this room? Why had it been hidden away like this, forgotten behind a door that blended into the walls? I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. I left the room that day, closing the door behind me and telling myself it was just an unused space, nothing more. But over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The image of the chair, sitting alone in the center of the room, haunted me. I found myself avoiding that part of the house, not wanting to go near the hidden staircase. But the room wouldn't let me forget. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the creaking of the old house, but as I lay there, straining to listen, they grew louder. Someone or something was walking down the hallway outside my bedroom. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was supposed to be empty. I lived alone. But the footsteps were real, their soft, rhythmic tap growing closer and closer. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and swung my legs over the edge of the bed, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. The hallway outside my room was dark, the old floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet as I stepped out of the bedroom. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there for a moment, holding my breath, listening to the silence. The house was still, the air thick with tension. I shone the flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing, just the empty corridor stretching out before me, the shadows flickering in the dim light. I turned to go back to bed, convincing myself that I had imagined the whole thing when I heard it again. This time, the sound wasn't footsteps. It was the faint, unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. I froze, my heart racing. The sound was coming from the hidden room, the one I had found at the top of the stairs. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I turned back toward the hallway, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my hand. I made my way slowly down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hidden door was slightly ajar, the narrow staircase beyond it shrouded in darkness. I hesitated at the foot of the stairs, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back, to leave the house and never come back. But something compelled me forward. I climbed the stairs, the old wood groaning under my weight. The door at the top of the stairs was open now, the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy window, casting long shadows across the floor. The room was exactly as I had left it bare, except for the chair in the center, but there was something different, something wrong. The chair had been moved. It was no longer facing the window. It was turned toward the door, as if someone had been sitting there waiting for me. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I shone the flashlight around the room. The air was thick, oppressive, and I could feel the weight of the room pressing down on me, suffocating me. I turned to leave, but then I heard it. A soft, whispering voice. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was faint, almost too soft to hear, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from the chair. I took a step back, my heart racing. The voice grew louder, more urgent, but I couldn't make out the words. It was as if the room itself was trying to speak to me, the walls closing in around me, the air growing heavier with each passing second. I stumbled toward the door, panic surging through me. The whispering followed me, growing louder and more frantic as I fled down the stairs, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly in front of me. I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house was silent again, but I could still hear the faint echo of the whispering, like a distant memory that refused to fade. I didn't go back up to the room after that. I couldn't. But the house wasn't the same after that night. It felt different, darker, colder. The whispers didn't stop. I could hear them in the walls, faint and insistent, growing louder every night. The chair, the voice, the hidden room, it all haunted me, lingering in my mind, filling every corner of the house with a sense of dread. One night, I woke to find the door at the end of the hall open again. This time I didn't go up. I packed my things the next day and left the house for good. I couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever was in that room, whatever had been forgotten behind that hidden door, wasn't meant to be disturbed. I never went back. I never went back. It was late autumn when I first moved into the old house at the edge of town. The air had that crisp, biting chill that heralded the arrival of winter, and the leaves had already turned into brilliant shades of red and gold, carpeting the ground in a soft, crunchy blanket. The house itself was large, older than I was used to, but it had a certain charm that drew me in from the moment I saw it. It stood alone on a small hill, its weathered brick walls and tall windows giving it a sense of dignity, as if it had stood through countless winters and storms, watching over the town below. At first, everything seemed perfect. The house was exactly what I had been looking for: spacious, secluded, and affordable. It had been empty for a few years before I moved in, but the realtor assured me that everything was in good shape, just in need of a little TLC. I spent the first few weeks getting settled, unpacking boxes, and exploring the nooks and crannies of the old place. The house had a few quirks: uneven floors, creaky doors, and the occasional draft, but that was to be expected with a building this old. But there was one thing I hadn't noticed right away. One small detail that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to gnaw at me. The window. There was a large, arched window on the second floor, just down the hall from my bedroom. It was the kind of window that might have once been a beautiful feature of the house, but over the years, the glass had become warped and dirty, and the frame was beginning to rot. I didn't think much of it at first, but after a while, I started to avoid looking at it. It wasn't that the window was particularly frightening, just that it felt wrong. Whenever I passed by it, I felt a strange sense of unease, like someone was watching me from the other side of the glass. It made no sense, of course. The window faced the backyard, which was surrounded by dense trees and overgrown bushes. There was no way anyone could be standing out there, watching me, but the feeling persisted. And I told myself it was just the atmosphere of the old house, The way the shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the rooms, or maybe the way the wind rattled the windows at night, making everything seem more sinister than it really was. I had always been prone to letting my imagination get the better of me, especially when I was alone in a big, empty house. But then, one night, I saw it. I had been lying in bed reading a book when I heard a soft tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the window, as it often did on stormy nights. But when I listened closer, I realized the tapping was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be caused by the wind. I set my book down and sat up, straining to listen. The tapping continued, slow and steady, as if someone or something was lightly knocking on the glass. I slipped out of bed and walked to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. I crept down the hall, my bare feet making almost no sound on the old wooden floor. The tapping grew louder as I approached the arched window. I stopped a few feet away, staring at the glass. The warped panes distorted the view of the backyard, twisting the trees and bushes into strange, almost unrecognizable shapes. But as I stood there, I realized there was something else in the window, something that didn't belong. A face. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. There, just beyond the glass, was the unmistakable outline of a face staring at me through the window. The features were blurry, distorted by the warped glass, but I could see the dark hollows of the eyes, the pale skin, and the thin, cracked lips pressed against the glass as if the figure was peering inside. My heart raced, and I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no one outside. There couldn't be. The house was surrounded by trees, and the backyard was empty, but the face was still there, watching me, unmoving. I took a step closer, my breath fogging up the cold glass as I leaned in, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its face pressed against the window, as if it had been waiting for me. Suddenly, the face vanished. I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The window was empty again, the warped glass reflecting only the dark shapes of the trees in the backyard. I ran back to my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking and my mind was racing with confusion and fear. What had I just seen? Had it been a trick of the light, a reflection, or had there really been someone or something standing outside my window? That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside sent a jolt of fear through me, and I found myself glancing toward the door, half expecting to see that face again, peering in at me from the darkness. The next morning, I tried to shake off the fear. I told myself it had been my imagination, that the old house was just playing tricks on me. I went about my day as usual, but the image of the face in the window lingered in the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't quite escape. Over the next few days, I avoided the window. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, afraid that I might see the face again. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt its presence, like a constant, nagging weight pressing down on me. And then, one night, the tapping returned. I had been drifting off to sleep when I heard it again, the same slow, rhythmic tapping on the glass. My heart raced, and I sat up in bed, listening. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was unmistakable, echoing down the hallway from the direction of the arched window. I told myself not to go, not to look, but I couldn't help it. I had to see if it was real. I slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway, my feet moving silently across the floor. The tapping grew louder as I approached the window, and my breath caught in my throat as I saw it again. The face. It was the same as before, pale, hollow-eyed, with thin, cracked lips pressed against the glass, but this time it was closer. I could see the dark shadows under the eyes, the way the skin seemed to sag, as if it had been drained of life. I stared at the face, frozen in place. It stared back at me, unmoving, its eyes dark and empty. And then, slowly, it smiled. The smile was grotesque, stretching the thin lips into a twisted, unnatural grin. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The face pressed closer to the glass, its breath fogging up the window. I could see its hands now, long and thin with fingers that seemed too long, too sharp, resting against the window frame. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty house as I fled back to my bedroom. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. The image of that twisted smile burned in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the face was still out there, watching me. I didn't sleep at all that night. The fear was too strong, too overwhelming. Every noise, every shadow made my heart race, and I found myself staring at the door, half expecting it to creak open, revealing that pale, grinning face. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. Whatever was outside that window, whatever had been watching me, I couldn't face it again. I packed my things that day, moving as quickly as I could, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. I didn't look at the window. I didn't want to see if the face was still there. By the afternoon, I was gone, leaving the old house and its twisted secrets behind. But even now, I can't forget the face in the window. It had been years since I'd been to the lake house. The last time I was there, I was just a kid spending summers swimming, fishing, and running through the woods with my cousins. The house had always felt like a safe haven, a place where the world slowed down, where you could forget about everything and just breathe. But when my grandmother passed away, the lake house had fallen into disuse, slowly deteriorating with time and neglect. I hadn't thought much about the place until I inherited it after my grandmother's death. It came as a surprise. My parents hadn't wanted the responsibility, and none of my aunts or uncles seemed interested in taking care of the property. So by default, it became mine. I didn't have the heart to sell it. The lake house held too many memories, too much nostalgia for me to let it go so easily. So one weekend, I decided to drive out there, just to check on the place, maybe fix it up a little. I thought it would be a nice getaway, a chance to relive those childhood memories and escape from the pressures of everyday life. I arrived at the lake house late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the water as I pulled up the gravel driveway. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but then again, I hadn't been there in over a decade. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged a little, and the windows were smudged with dirt, but it was still standing. It still felt like home. I parked the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the cool, crisp air. The lake stretched out in front of me, calm and still, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. The trees that surrounded the property were tall and thick, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was beautiful, peaceful. But as I stood there, staring at the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was subtle, just a faint sense of unease that prickled at the back of my mind. Maybe it was the way the house seemed to loom over me, casting long shadows across the driveway. Or maybe it was the silence, the kind of heavy, oppressive silence that pressed in on you, making you hyper-aware of every little sound. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the strangeness of being back after so many years. The house was old. That was all. It needed work. Once I got inside and settled, I was sure that nostalgic warmth would return. I grabbed my bag from the car and made my way up the front steps, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. The front door was stiff, the lock rusted, but after a bit of jiggling, I managed to get it open. The inside of the house was just as I remembered, simple, cozy, but a little worse for wear. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and damp wood. The furniture was old, the cushions on the couch sagging, and the curtains were faded, but everything was still there. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, as if nothing had changed since the last time I'd been there. I set my bag down and walked through the house, flicking on the lights. The electricity still worked, thank God, but the dim yellow bulbs cast long, eerie shadows across the room. I checked the kitchen, the small bathroom, and the 2 bedrooms, making sure everything was in order. The house was empty, but that sense of unease lingered, a faint weight in the pit of my stomach. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just an old house, after all. Old houses made noises, and being alone in a place like this could mess with your head. I'd feel better after a good night's sleep. After I unpacked, I decided to take a walk down to the lake. The sun had set by now, and the sky was a deep, inky blue, with just a hint of orange on the horizon. The water was still, almost unnaturally so, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the trees in the breeze. I sat down on the old wooden dock, letting my feet dangle over the edge, my toes skimming the surface of the water. The cool night air felt refreshing, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax. The lake house had always been a place of peace for me, and sitting there, with the quiet and the stars overhead, I could almost convince myself that everything was okay. But then I heard it. A soft splash. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it stood out. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I stared out at the lake. The water was calm, undisturbed, but I could have sworn I heard something like someone or something moving just beneath the surface. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just a fish or a turtle. The lake was full of wildlife after all. But as I sat there staring at the water, the unease returned, stronger this time. There was something out there. I stood up, wiping my hands on my pants, and made my way back to the house, my footsteps echoing softly on the wooden dock. The feeling of being watched crawled over my skin, and I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. Once I was inside, I locked the door behind me, double-checking the bolt. I laughed nervously to myself, trying to shake off the fear. It was ridiculous. I was just letting the isolation get to me. The lake house was perfectly safe. I had spent countless summers here as a kid, swimming in that lake, running through those woods, and nothing had ever happened. I decided to make myself a cup of tea, hoping it would calm my nerves. The kitchen was small but functional, and after a few minutes, the kettle began to whistle. I poured the hot water into a mug and carried it over to the living room, settling onto the couch with a blanket wrapped around me. I sipped the tea slowly, staring out the window at the dark trees that surrounded the house. The wind had picked up, and the branches swayed and creaked in the breeze. The sense of unease hadn't left me, but the warmth of the tea and the familiarity of the house helped to soothe my nerves. Until I heard the splash again. This time it was louder, closer. I set my mug down, my heart racing. The sound was coming from the lake, I was sure of it. I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. The lake was just barely visible through the trees, a dark, shimmering expanse in the moonlight. For a moment, I saw nothing. Just the stillness of the water, the gentle rustling of the trees. But then I saw movement. A figure standing at the edge of the lake. My breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to make out any details, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was out there, standing motionless at the edge of the water, staring out at the lake. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. Who could it be? The lake house was isolated, miles away from the nearest town. No one should be out here, especially not at this time of night. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I fumbled to unlock it. No signal. Panic surged through me, and I glanced back at the window. The figure was still there, unmoving, watching the lake. I locked the door, checking the windows to make sure they were secure. My mind was spinning with fear and confusion. Who was that? What were they doing out there? And why were they just standing there, motionless, staring at the water? I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a local, someone out for a late night walk. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the moonlit water. I stayed up all night, sitting on the couch with my phone in my hand, waiting for the figure to leave. But when dawn finally broke, the figure was gone. I told myself I had imagined it, that the isolation, the darkness, had played tricks on my mind, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The next day, I decided to leave. As I packed my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there watching me. The lake house, once a place of peace and safety, now felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. I locked the door behind me and walked down to the car, my heart pounding in my chest. The lake was calm, just as it had been the night before, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, standing motionless at the water's edge. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave.